Hi, I'm Michael Sherlock, author of the three-volume series I Am Christ. Now, if there's one thing I love more than peanut butter, it's when Christian apologists attempt to use logic to defend their superstitions. Now, I just wanted to address one of these attempts and show that the fallacy, in this case at least, resides with the apologist. Many Christian apologists argue that when non-believers criticize the violence which has stemmed from the alleged word of God, that such criticisms are illogical. Specifically, they argue that the non-believer's argument is a non sequitur argument. Now, this is simply a fancy way of saying that proposition B doesn't follow from situation A logically. In this case, specifically, they argue that you cannot hold God liable for the harm that his word has caused. Now, by harm, of course, I'm referring to the Holy Inquisitions, the auto de fe or public burnings of heretics, witches, blasphemers, and non-Christians. I'm talking about the slave trade, the mass drowning of witches by the Puritans, the wholesale slaughter and disenfranchisement of large Jewish communities, the destruction of ancient literature and art, homophobia, gender inequality, and the list goes on and on and on. Now that we've established that harm has ensued from the word of God, and I've given the most common and well-known examples, we need to show that it is logical to lay the blame on the creator of this word. And of course, we're speaking hypothetically, as there is a mountain of evidence to suggest that the Bible is not the word of God, and we have insufficient evidence, in my opinion, to believe that a God even exists. But here we're arguing from the Christian's theological point of view in order to establish that it is logical to say that the God of Abraham, as fictitious as he probably is responsible for his word. Now, I think the best way to demonstrate the logic of the anti-theist's point of view here is to frame the argument in a legal context, as the foundation of many of our legal principles are rooted in logic. And that's in no way to say that our legal system as a whole is logical, just that certain principles of logic are employed in creating many of our laws. The example I would like to use relates to the tort or civil law of negligence. Now, among other criteria, to successfully establish negligence, you need to show that the defendant's act or omission, and omission is simply a lack of act, which caused the injury or damage, was reasonably foreseeable. In other words, they should have really known that their act or omission would have caused the injury to the plaintiff or injured party. To give you a very basic and slightly oversimplified example, let's say someone is standing between myself and a target I want to hit with a large rock. And despite the danger of hitting them, I throw the rock toward the target anyway. And instead of hitting the target, the rock knocks that person unconscious. This would be deemed to be an act which I should have reasonably known not to do. Firstly, I'd be an idiot, and secondly, the injury caused by such an act would be deemed to have been reasonably foreseeable. Now, there is an exception which would allow me to do the same thing and not be held liable for negligence, but this would require me to be mentally unfit to make such a judgment. So the state of the mind of the defendant or the capacity of the defendant is also taken into consideration when determining whether or not an act or omission is considered to be reasonably foreseeable. In other words, if it was not reasonably foreseeable to the defendant, then it was not reasonably foreseeable in a legal sense, and the negligence suit would fail. Now here we arrive at our punchline, so to speak. But before delivering this punchline, allow me to give you a slightly more relevant example of how reasonable foreseeability applies to the negligence action we could bring against Jesus' dad, or Jesus himself, depending on your Christological perspective, and why the theist's position in this case is rife with fallacy. If someone, let's say in the USA, buys my book series, I Am Christ, and finds justification in there to injure another person, justification I've gone out of my way in the book to subvert, then my act of writing and condoning the publishing of my book would not be deemed to have been negligent, because it was not reasonably foreseeable to me, Michael Sherlock, that my book series would cause that injury. There are other tests to determine, I guess, the common standard of a person's capacity to make a judgment. But as I said before, the state of mind of the particular defendant is very relevant to establishing whether or not they could reasonably foresee harm would ensue from their action or lack of action. Okay, now here is where we might draw a dramatic distinction between my non-violent book series, written by a fallible human author, me, and a violent library of books, the Bible, written by an omniscient, that is, all-knowing author, God. Remember that the state of mind of the defendant is key to establishing whether or not the injury resulting from their act or omission is reasonably foreseeable. Okay? Now, if I, like God, as Christians believe, could count the hairs on every human head, keep my eye on every sparrow on earth, in other words, and know the beginning from the end, in other words, if I was endowed with omniscience, then it logically follows that I would know exactly how my word would be used and what the results would be with regards to any ambiguities contained in those words. In short, it logically follows that an all-knowing God is responsible for his word and that any injury caused by that word is reasonably foreseeable due to the infinitely advanced state of mind of the defendant, who is in this case said to be all-knowing. Further, we could argue that not only did God commit a negligent act, but that his omissions are just as liable. He failed to expressly prevent those events he knew would transpire as a result of his word, the inquisitions, etc. And even though he could reasonably foresee that failing to expressly forbid those things, like the Inquisition, the Crusades, etc., would cause injury. So, in summation, the theist position in this case that it's not logical to blame God, an all-knowing God, for how his word has been used is illogical. For God would know everything, and he would know all the implications regarding how his word will be put to use. And I guess that's all I've got to talk about today. So yeah, thanks.